God morgen. Hello. Hello, hello, hello. You hear it? You hear me? No. Hello, hello, hello. God morgen. God morgen og velkommen til den nye auditorium utsikt. Som dere ser, dere som sitter i midten, hvis dere må ta en kjapp tur ute midt i en presentasjon, da må dere forstyrre 5-6 personer for å komme ned, for å komme ut. Så vi prøver å ha jevnlig pauser i løpet av formiddagen, så da er det mulig å bevege seg mellom presentasjoner. I'm really happy to be welcoming you this morning on the behalf of myself and our European colleagues that are here today to present on a great topic, supporting parental involvement in sport, the conference for coaches. I, like many of you guys here, have experience coaching children, coaching youth. A lot of us end up being involved in our kids' sports and translation of scientific knowledge in the experience of coaching is not always an easy task. So today in the different presentation, we will have an overview of important research findings, but also some really practical tips about how we can apply and translate that knowledge into practice. We have a very nice schedule throughout the day, and then tonight we meet again, and the presentation will focus on parents with some practical advice for parents on coaching their own children and the friends of their children. So I'm happy to introduce Dr. Camilla Knight from Swansea, and she will introduce the concept of this collaboration and also go into her talk. I have to say, this is a really good example of knowledge translation, and I think this is a model we'll try to follow up on, where all the presentations from today are streamed live. They will be available if you go quickly online after the conference and you want to review some of the presentations. It will be possible for you through the website. And then the website is the name of the organization that you see, sportparent.eu. And on the website, there's some more information that you can read, some articles that are referenced there as well. So this can be something that you use in your own organization, in your own clubs, or just in your own family. So thank you. The word is yours, Camilla.
Welcome. Thank you all so much for coming. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us today, where we have a chance to share a number of different talks, as Nick mentioned, on this project that we've been working on. So before I get into my talk, I thought I'd just give you a bit of an overview of how this day is going to work and really what the purpose was. So about 18 months ago, a group of us, you'll see most of the people presenting today, started to meet to discuss what sorts of topics we thought were important for parents to know about. And the reason for that really is that we know parents are critical in sport. We know that without the involvement of parents, whether it's just in terms of bringing their children to sport or coaching their children, youth sport really wouldn't exist in the way that it does. But unfortunately, it can be really hard for parents to know what to do. There's lots of information available. There's lots of confusing information available. And so really trying to figure out, well, what's the best things for parents to know about? What's going to help them really enhance the experience of their children? And underpinning all of this was really an understanding that not only do we want children to have successful and enjoyable experiences, but we want those experiences to be safe. We want children to be involved in sport and have psychologically safe experiences, physically safe, mentally safe experiences. So what you see represented on this slide here are the topics that are going to be discussed today and the topics that we're talking about on our website. But before we go into the individual topics and before we give you some insights into the different areas, I just want to frame the whole day with a bit of an understanding about what it's like for parents themselves. I'm sure a number of you are parents in this room, and you've had experiences of parenting your children through sport. But when you shift to a coaching hat and you start to think about it as a coach, it can be more challenging to think, well, how do we engage with parents? So I'm going to spend half an hour talking a little bit about the parenting experience, and then we'll shift into Professor Chris Harwood, who's going to talk more about what are the best things that parents can do before we move into a stream of other presentations. There is one slight change to the schedule. Our very last talk isn't happening. That's going to be replaced with a question and answer session because unfortunately that speaker couldn't join us, but it might mean you get away a little bit earlier if that's important to you as well. So, why would we want to talk about parents? Why would we want to talk about optimizing parental involvement in sport? Well, we've spent a lot of time talking about the positive consequences of parents being involved in sport and the negative consequences. We know that when parents are involved, and they're involved in very positive or appropriate ways, it can lead to a whole host of positive outcomes for children. They train appropriately, they're able to develop good relationships, they're motivated, they enjoy the experience, and most importantly, they stay in sport for a long time. On the other hand, however, when parents aren't involved in the right types of ways, for whatever reasons those might be, we know that it can lead to feelings of pressure and anxiety, it can lead to children burning out, it can lead to overtraining, it can lead to a whole host of negative kind of outcomes. And because we've known that there's positive and negative outcomes associated with parents, there's been a lot of research and a lot of work saying, okay, well, surely let's just encourage parents to do these positive things, stop them doing these negative things, and then everyone will have a better experience. However, we know that youth sport is much more complicated than that. When we talk to parents, when we talk to coaches, when we talk to children, it's not simply a matter of these are good things to do and these are bad things to do. It's much more about understanding that intricate relationship between a parent and a child, knowing what's important for that child, knowing what's important for that parent, and really having an understanding of why everyone is involved. So rather than simply saying parents should be doing this or they shouldn't be doing this, what we have to start understanding is what's going on within youth sport, what's going on within the environment, and why might we see different things from different parents. So rather than me talk about being a parent, because I'm not one, I've spoken to lots of parents, but I'm not one, I thought I'd just give you a little clip. So this is one of the videos that's on our website. And we asked parents, we didn't prompt them, we didn't prep them, we just said to parents, what's it like being a parent of a child involved in sport? And I'll just give you a short clip from this video with them, hopefully if it works, talking about what they feel when they're parenting their children. Oh.
Being a parent with a child involved in sport is it's hard work. You've got to give a lot of commitment. There's a lot of travelling involved, financial aspects as well. There's a lot of commitment there. But when you see your child doing so well and you see the progression they make from tournament to tournament and even just in training, it's just really rewarding.
One of the main roles I've taken on as a parent, certainly with my two children, mentor, nurse, taxi driver, counsellor, mediator at times between them, and sometimes between them and me. But also, you know, being their friend as well is a massive part of it. You know, they're not just my children, they're my friends.
As a parent of children involved in sport, one of the challenges is the financial aspects of it, especially when they participate in a few different sports. Like my youngest does swimming, plays football and plays golf. I mean, and he enjoys all three.
Twice a week we do 5 a.m. starts at the national pool, that's a different demanding, but it's equally as demanding. My son is 12 and he swims 16 hours a week, and he competes twice a month in competitions. So again, it's great to see him develop. His body and muscle and physique is far better than his dad's at the age of 12. But yeah, it's brilliant. I didn't think my son would be committed to get up at 5 in the morning to go swimming, but he does for 2 hours and then goes to school and then comes home and then swims 2 hours again that night. So, you know, I've learned a lot about his stamina and his commitment, but equally I've learned that I have to be available as dad's taxi to make sure he's there to do what he needs to do. So, yeah, it's good. Very rewarding and very enjoyable to see them succeed.
Watching her out there is very stressful as a parent. I think you see them in training and there's a lot of, they're very relaxed in training, whereas in a tournament setting they're a bit more pressure and they make mistakes a lot. And as a parent, you're conscious that they look at you sometimes and you're making facial expressions and you really try not to. So it's a bit stressful watching. You try and sort of stay near enough for them to know you're there, but far away so they can't really read your facial expressions. I've got to learn that over the years.
So the video continues, but hopefully it just gives you a bit of an idea. So when you ask parents, when you ask them unprompted, what's it like having children involved in sport, they start off with, these are some of the demands, these are some of the challenges, these are some of the issues, but also they highlight a whole host of benefits that are associated with their children's involvement. Now, obviously, if you're sitting in this room, if you think about that, well, if parents are feeling too many demands, if parents are feeling too many pressures, that's potentially going to impact on how they engage with their children, how they engage with sport, and how they engage with kind of the overall experience. On the other hand, if they're having great experiences and they're seeing all of these benefits and they're able to recognize all of these positive outcomes, then you would anticipate that that's going to lead them to being involved in really positive ways and really helping their children in the best possible manner. So when we started to do this project, we were really interested in trying to say, well, how can we make sure that parents see those benefits? How can we make sure that parents are accessing good and useful information and really able to have a positive experience with their children? Because when we start to think about the experience for parents, and we start to think about what might be going on for children and relate it to the experience of parents, you can start to uncover some really interesting things. If we take the example of Andre Agassi, apologies, my references throughout this are mostly tennis, because that's what I know the best. If we take the example of Andre Agassi, for many of you, I'm sure you're aware of the experience he had growing up. He had a very challenging childhood. He was engaged in a lot of training. His dad really pushed him. He went off the rails. He had all sorts of challenges through his career. And he talks about that at length in his autobiography. And in his autobiography, he makes a comment that really nicely matches up with something that his father had also written in his autobiography. So at the top, we have a quote there from Mike Agassi, Andre's father, who talked about the fact that he recognized that he'd probably got it wrong. He recognized that he pushed his son too hard, but he did it out of love. He did it because he thought that was going to be a good thing to do. He thought that was going to help his son succeed. And you can see when Andre talks about his involvement of his dad, he recognized that there was some positives behind it, that he wasn't setting out to make his life terrible. It was just the way in which he went about doing it wasn't as effective as it could be. And when we start to think about the literature, when we start to think about what's going on in the environment, we can start to uncover potentially why some of those challenges are happening or why some of those behaviors are present from parents. Increasingly, we know that the youth sport environment is getting more and more professionalized. We know that children are being encouraged to get into sport at a younger age, that they're being encouraged to take it more seriously, that they're getting team kit. In the UK, for instance, we know children are getting into some professional academies at 6, 7, 8 years old. we know that that then relates to very high expectations of parents. So if you've got this dream, if you as a parent are being sold this idea that your children need to be in professional environments, they need to be training this amount of time, they need to have all of the right kit, that comes with financial challenges for parents, it comes with time demands for parents, and then they're encouraged to stay in that environment with this lure of a professional career. So if you invest now, if you keep working with your children, work with us as coaches, really invest at this young age, maybe they've got a hope of being a professional. We know, and I'm sure as coaches here in the room, you're very aware that we don't want children pushed into one sport at an early age. We don't want them really over-investing in a sport when they're 5 or 6. But the sports environment is selling that to parents. So we know that in this environment where it's this race to the bottom, who can we get in sooner, who can we get in younger? Parents are going to take guidance from those around them, and people are telling them this is the best thing to do. And so consequently, parents are finding themselves sucked into this environment that's very pressurized, that's very focused on performance from a very young age. So obviously, if we think about that environment, we can start to see, well, why might it be hard for parents? Why might they struggle? Why might they engage in the ways we don't want them to do? Well, the first thing is, what can we change in the environment? And as coaches within your environment, you have an opportunity to address that. Are you selling the messages of early specialization? Are you encouraging your parents to really push children to be involved at a young age? Or are you recognizing actually if they're involved in a number of sports and we keep things playful, and you'll hear a lot about this throughout the day, what message are you selling? Also, we think about the culture, and we know that it's very expensive often, that parents are having to invest a lot in equipment, they're investing a lot in traveling, they're investing a lot in coaching sessions. And again, can we as an overall, I guess, within youth sport or within specific clubs, can we consider that and can we address that? Because those sorts of pressures and those sorts of demands make it hard for parents. But it's not just the culture. There's a whole host of factors that impact on parents within sport. And obviously there's competitions. So coming from the UK, we hear a lot about parents at the sidelines, particularly in football matches. We hear about parents engaging in abusive behaviors, shouting out the wrong sorts of things. But when you flip it, and instead of just standing as an observer looking at parents, if you flip it and you go, well, what's going on for parents? Why might they be responding in this way? You can start to potentially understand, not to justify, but to understand why we might see some of those behaviors. So again, to give you an example, this is Rafael Nadal's mother speaking in an interview. So this is the mother of someone who's the world #1 right now, who's been in sport for decades, who's achieved at the highest level. And she talks about watching him compete. And she talks about how hard it is for her to watch him, to see him trying to fight, knowing the injuries he's been through, getting frustrated at the crowd. When you think about it from a parent's perspective, well, of course we might see some of that emotion. You would hope to see some of that emotion. We would want to know that a parent is there, that they care about their child, that there's a relationship with their child, and that they're feeling for their child. And when we talk to parents, and I spend a lot of time talking to parents, one of the hardest things for them as a parent is standing on the sidelines and watching their children out there competing. It's one of the only environments where you have the potential to see your child succeed and fail. When children are doing exams, the parents aren't sitting behind them and watching them put the wrong answers in. Right? They're not there when they're having disagreements with their friends in the playgrounds, but they're there in sport. They're watching them do well. They're watching them have struggles. They're watching those disappointments. And it's very, very emotive. It's very emotional for parents because of that attachment. And then when you add in the consideration that parents are going to have to be the ones who have the conversations with their children at the end of the match, they're the ones who have to pick the pieces up, they're the ones that have to put them together if it hasn't gone so well, you can start to see, well, yes, there might be some emotion boiling here, and those sorts of challenges might impact on what we see and how parents engage. But it's not just about sport for parents either. So as coaches, as practitioners, as people working within youth sport, it's really easy to think about parents as just the people on the sidelines or just the people who've brought their kids to training or made sure that they're clothed. But parents have a much bigger role than sport. Parents have to raise their children. And when we think about that and we think about all the demands that come with just parenting a child or just raising a child in sport, we can start to get a better appreciation of why giving parents the right information, giving parents information that's useful and really guides them in the right ways are important. Because if we just look at this diagram very simply, we know that for sports parents to be involved in the best possible ways, we need them to address the demands of their child. We need them to know what to say, when to say it, how to respond. And when you talk to athletes, which I'm sure you all do on a regular basis, ask them if their parents get it right, and they invariably laugh and say, no, they'll always get it wrong, because at some point they're gonna say the wrong thing. So we know that parents have to manage the demands and the needs of their child. We also know that parents have to manage the demands of coaches. So if you're a coach who has very strict rules about athletes showing up on time, that's a demand on the athlete, but that's a demand on the parent. So if they've been rushing and they've come from work late and they've hit traffic on the way, and they're now panicking because if they get their child late to you in a training session, their child's going to be in trouble, that becomes a huge pressure for them as a parent. And we all know that life happens and sometimes you can't necessarily get there in the right time. If as a coach you like to leave your selection until the couple of days before an event, that's a pressure for parents. They don't know, am I going to be there supporting, and am I going to be comforting my child because they've not been selected? All of these decisions you make as a coach, those impact on parents as well. Then we have things like competitions. How well is the competition run? Is it a really long day? Is it well structured? Are there lots of demands? Are there lots of pressures on parents? Do they have to sit at the venue for 10 hours? Is there access to food and drink? All of those sorts of things, those are pressures that parents have to consider. And then unfortunately, they also have to deal with the general perception of what makes a good parent. So in the UK particularly, we like to spend a lot of time bashing our parents in the media. We spend a lot of time with media headlines talking about what parents have done well, what parents have done poorly, what makes a good parent, what makes a bad parent. You should be feeding them this, you shouldn't be feeding them this, you should be getting them to these sessions, you shouldn't be getting them to these sessions. And we live in an environment where parents are getting all sorts of mixed messages and they're put under all sorts of pressures to try and get it right for their children. And the only time that we, at least in the UK, really celebrate parents for getting it right is if their children win gold medals. Right? So when their children win gold medals at the Olympics, we parade them on the media. Suddenly they're stars. Look at this, isn't this exciting? Well done for getting your children this far. But when their kids don't get it wrong, we will just tell you all the things you're doing it wrong until they succeed, right? So there's this real tension around, no, parents are really important and we'll celebrate them, but on the other hand, we'll kind of have a go at them along the way. Then obviously, your coaches or you're all working, you have those demands, right? You just have demands of work and life, and maybe there's other siblings, and maybe there's other children, and maybe, just maybe, you think you might like a social life every so often, and you might like to be able to do something else. All of those pressures are building up for parents as well. And then finally, there's fundamentally, as a parent, you've got to get to the end of every day and make sure your child's still alive, they're still fed, they've had some food, they're fully clothed, and you can get them to bed and start again the next day. So we know there's lots going on for parents. And when we add in some of the specific demands within sport, when we start to consider some of the demands around competition, all of those things I talked about before. When we start to consider some of those logistical demands, how do I get them there on time? What do I do when I have one kid who needs to be one side of the city and another kid who has to be another side of the city and they're at the same time? How do I travel away for a weekend when I should be somewhere else? How do I fund it? All of these sorts of demands. And then also the demand that parents have of trying to make the right decision for their children, for their future. Right? It's not just for now, it's every decision they're making is potentially impacting on their future. When you add in those sorts of demands, you can really start to appreciate that actually we can't just throw parents and children into sport. We can't just hope that they figure it all out. Instead, as coaches, we really want to make sure that we're working with parents and helping them to get the best possible experience. So how can you do that? First thing, my suggestion is to take the time to really understand what's going on for your parents. Understand the competitive demands. Put yourselves on the sideline. If you're parents yourselves, you'll be able to think about this really easily. How does it feel to see your child injured? How does it feel to see them not get selected? How does it feel to see them performing really badly, or see them upset, or see them performing really well? Take some time and think about those demands. Think about what's going on for parents. Because if you can start to understand what's going on for parents, you're going to be in a better position going forward. I actually sent an email recently. I was fortunate to be away at a rugby camp, and I'd been in communication with a parent, and I said, I hope that it was match day, and I'd been in touch, and I said, I hope you have a good day. And the response I got was, a good day? I'm sick to my stomach. What if my son gets injured and I'm not there? And as soon as you see that written down, and you could feel the emotion of how she was on that day, you knew that there was the potential that if something happened, this could be a real challenge for that parent. So firstly, you need to understand those demands. The second one is understanding the organizational demands. So how many of you as coaches have spoken to your parents and understand how much sport is costing them, or understand how they're trying to fit sport in within their lives? Do you know how many other children they have and what other commitments they're trying to address? Do you understand how they feel about you as a coach and what they want from you as a coach? Do you understand potentially that your philosophy as a coach may not match with what they're aiming for? Do you understand the frustrations that they have potentially with your sports federations or your organizational bodies? Understanding, taking the time to understand those challenges and those broader demands are really important. And finally, still on the understanding perspective, consider what's going on for parents. When you ask them to take a child out of school, or you ask a parent to make a commitment to send their child off for a training camp or a competition for a weekend, those decisions are taking a lot of thought. Do I take them out of school? Do I send them to academies? Do I send them on these events? What's the impact on their social life? My child's no longer getting invited to anything. What should I do? All of these sorts of decisions about their future, about their child's future as a person, as an academic, so within the school setting, and as an athlete, these all play against each other, and actually taking the time to really understand what that's like for parents is important. And then once you've done that, once you've had a chance to think about those demands and think about what's going on for parents, then you can take some really easy steps to provide support. Do you give your parents an opportunity to talk about what it's like to parent their children? Do you give your parents an opportunity to think about the emotions they might experience? I've talked a little bit about what it's like maybe to see your child get injured. Have you ever had a conversation with parents and said, if there's an injury, how do you think you might feel, and how would you respond, and what would you like us to do? Or when they're winning, when they're losing, what's making you respond? What's going on for you? Because if you talk to parents, if you help them anticipate some of those emotions and some of those situations that they encounter, then hopefully you'll be in a position where they can prepare for that. So if you know that when your child's disappointed, it's really hard for you, and it's really stressful, and it's really challenging, and it impacts on me as a parent, well, then you can start to put some steps in place, and you can start to develop some strategies. For instance, actually, when we go to competitions, I'm going to stand with a friend, and I'm going to talk when those situations happen. Or when there's an injury, I know that there's a protocol, and I'm going to make sure that protocol's followed through. So having an opportunity to anticipate what's going on can be really, really helpful. The other thing that you can do as coaches is really try and act out some of those situations. Can you give parents opportunities within a kind of a safe space, within a room, or if you have a parents' meeting or something at the beginning of the season or halfway through the season, give them a chance. Tell them that this is role play, that this isn't actually the situation, but tell them that their son or their daughter's not been chosen for a team for a week. Ask them to role play that. How would they respond? How would you like them to talk to you? How would they like you to talk to them? Give them opportunities to work through some of those situations can be really, really helpful. The other thing you can do, and again, this is something that I think as practitioners and as coaches we probably don't do enough, is actually give parents some guidance around conversations. It's a really hard one to make that decision around telling parents what to do and then understanding that what parents need to do can be different. But hopefully what you'll see in our booklet is that there's a number of different tips that we've kind of pulled together from the literature. And when we talk to parents, one of the biggest challenges that they tell us is they don't know what to say. How do I start a conversation after a competition? How do I respond? What should I be saying on the sidelines? How should I engage with my child? The first thing you want to encourage them to do is talk to their child, right? You want them to talk to their child, talk about the experiences that they've had to date, but then give them some suggestions. You'll hear a lot in the talks coming up around the types of messages and the types of behaviors that we would want to see. And then the other thing you can do as coaches is really work with parents to help them reappraise or rethink the situations that occur at competitions. So as a parent, I think it's understandable that if your child gets pulled off the field, or your child doesn't start, or you see your child potentially receive an unfair call, or you perceive that the referee's not in the favour of your child, you're going to have a reaction, and it's going to be in terms of, well, that wasn't fair, there were things going on for my child, this wasn't the right decision, like what impact that's going to have negatively. But as a coach, if you work with parents, you can actually help them to see the benefits of some of those situations, the challenges, but then the gains. So yes, maybe there was an unfair call, or maybe your child was pulled off from the game, but actually now they've had an opportunity to think around, how do I respond in those situations, and what would I do next time? And there's all sorts of benefits that come from the ups and the downs that are experienced within sport. And as a coach, if you spend some time talking to your parents about that, that can be really helpful for them going forwards. The other thing that you can do, and this is always a bit of a thorny topic with coaches, because there's been a long-held belief, at least in the UK, that we kind of keep parents away and we don't like to work with them too much. But the other thing you can do is actively make time to work with your parents. So what would that look like? Well, the first thing is giving opportunities for your parents to really raise issues, to raise concerns, to talk about some of the challenges that they may face. Develop some strategies around those conversations. When would you like them to happen? How would you like parents to communicate with you? You can encourage parents to really reflect on the situations. So whilst we might encourage athletes to think about what went on in a competition or why did things happen in the way they happened, think about that from a parent's perspective. Can you encourage them to either reflect with their child or think about things individually and really try and identify, well, how did I respond? Why did I respond this way? What would have been better for my child going forwards? The other thing that can be very useful for parents to minimize some of those demands is encouraging parents to work together. That might seem like a really straightforward and simple strategy, but especially for new parents into a club, sometimes it can be hard to know the other parents, to work out what can we do, how can we really come together to work as well as we can. So encouraging communication, encouraging that via social media or whatever works for them, encouraging lift sharing, giving parents a feeling that they can have a week off, that they don't have to always be present and always be there can be really, really useful. The other thing that might be a benefit and that's relatively straightforward to put into place is think about how much you're communicating with parents. In the UK, at least, parents go into school every term or every semester and they get feedback from teachers about how their children are doing. We don't tend to do that in sport. We don't really tend to talk to parents about what's going on with their children, what their goals are, how well they're doing, how they're improving, but actually having some regular communication once a month maybe, or whatever kind of works for you, every 6 weeks, just either via email or face-to-face, where you say, this is what we've been working on, this is what your son or your daughter's achieved, this is the aims going forward, these are the competitions. It can really just alleviate a whole host of concerns from a parent's perspective. The final two things are both about you as coaches within your environment. So I mentioned right at the beginning, how can you as parents ensure that you are facilitating, how can you as coaches ensure that you're facilitating good environments for parents? So rather than being a coach who's adding to those demands and adding to those challenges and making the life of a parent more difficult, are there things that you could do to make it easier? Can you shift training by 10 minutes and actually now they can all finish their work day and get there on time without rushing through the traffic? Can you look into sponsorship or find some ways of addressing some of those financial demands? Can you talk to the team of coaches and make sure that you're all focused on developmentally appropriate approaches to coaching? Are there things that you could do within your environment that would make it slightly less demanding and slightly less challenging for parents? Because fundamentally, we know that parents are an absolutely critical component of youth sport. I said at the beginning that without parents, youth sport wouldn't really exist, and I know within Norway, parents are often the coaches as well, so it's really, really important that we have parents on side and involved in the best possible ways. But it's not easy being a parent. It's not easy being a parent of a child involved in sport, whether that's at the lowest recreational grassroots level or all the way up to the elite level. There's demands on time and money and emotion. And if we really want to have parents involved in the best possible way, we want to be creating an environment where they've got access to information, where they feel supported and where they feel guided. Because if we develop that sort of environment, then we can start to ensure that parents are fulfilling all the different roles and responsibilities that will optimize their children's experience in sport. And so I'm going to hand over to Chris now, who's going to talk a little bit about what those roles and responsibilities might look like. What can parents do to really optimize their involvement? Once Chris is finished, we're then going to have a quick question and answer between Chris and myself, and then we'll move into different topics. So, that's me. And this is Chris. Good.
Thanks a lot, Camilla. Can everyone hear me okay? Excellent. Well, just first of all, I'd like to thank Nick and the university for hosting us today for this series of presentations, and also, obviously, for all the coaches who've taken the time and effort to come and listen to us and hopefully take on board the messages that we're going to share with you today, and also all those individuals who are listening in on the live stream in a variety of countries around the world. I think Camilla's really teed up a place for me to come in and reinforce, I guess, the complexity of roles and responsibilities that parents have in youth sport. And I want to shine more of a light on a few of those things that she's touched upon, both based upon some of the research in this area, also from personal experiences of working with parents and with children in youth sport over the last sort of 25 years or so. And I want to, I guess, preface this by talking about their roles, but also the ways in which you can, as coaches, can facilitate parents in optimizing their roles and responsibilities. So whilst I'll shine a light on what I think are key roles for parents, I'll also be very focused on looking at what the implications are for you as coaches. Because I think the contemporary coach nowadays has many more dimensions to their work than ever there used to be a number of years ago. And I think there's a greater responsibility that are placed upon coaches, and it's particularly in our country, in the UK, around duty of care, around some of the cultural challenges that we've faced, that have been reported on in the media in the last 18 months, and mental health issues. So in the UK, there's a really prime focus right now on looking at the fact that there's a team around the athlete trying to support the athlete in and through sport optimally, and what we do to influence and how we influence young people on a day-to-day basis is absolutely critical, and there's a lot more thought that needs to go into the stakeholders working together to allow an athlete, a young child, to have an optimal experience. You're joining actually a journey with the parent, and I think Camilla's tried to really shape the types of experiences that parents are going on when they're helping a child develop through a sporting experience. And of course, you're a key person in shaping that journey, for them. And of course, parents come into that journey from very different backgrounds and very different positions. So, here you have Judy Murray. You might not have recognised her, but that's Judy and Andy Murray and Jamie Murray, tennis players a long time ago. And of course, what you see noticeably here is the fact that they're 2 feet smaller and then 2 feet taller, than her 20 years later or so. But she's been on a journey with those two children, and of course, she's come from a background where she's been a tennis player and a coach in tennis and supporting those individuals. She's very different to the variety of backgrounds that some of the parents of the children you coach will come to. And it's a little bit like arriving yesterday at baggage claim in Oslo Airport, looking at the different types of baggage coming around the conveyor belt, thinking that everyone's different. And sometimes you have to just recognize that every parent is different from a different background. Because even me as a psychologist, I have expectations, and I think, well, why aren't they behaving that way? And I have to check myself to think, yeah, everyone is different. They come from different backgrounds, different experiences, different circumstances, and it's just pausing for a moment and recognizing that. So wherever they are on the journey as a parent, whether they have a sport background, don't have a sport background, etc., their influence on their child and their role with their child will certainly be dependent on the clarity of their role. So I want to put a few things up here which I think are kind of important for coaches to help parents to have an optimal role with their child. And the first starting point is role clarity, is helping them understand what is their role and what isn't their role in your particular sport. And it's also worth just reminding that different sports, even coaches in this different room, will come from different cultures and subcultures of sports. So tennis in the UK is very different to football in the UK. Football academies, here's my 9-year-old, just take him, coach, and turn him into whoever. Whereas in tennis, it's kind of individual sport. Coaches don't often go to matches, to competitions to watch. The parent is the assistant coach because they're the caregiver attending the event with the child all the time. And of course, therefore, you have different roles and responsibilities of parents according to some of the norms and cultures of the sport and the sport types in which they're participating. But you yourself as a coach of your sport will know more clearly the types of roles that parents can play optimally, that they could play more a role of, maybe things that aren't their role. But if you help parents to clarify that, and the next step is role knowledge. So do they then have the knowledge to be able to complete that role? And your responsibility to help them, with that. in a way which helps their child in competition, in training, and in terms of their development of life skills beyond just sport and through sport. Role knowledge will lead to role confidence, where you have parents who have more self-belief about themselves when supporting their child, which is something that we focus greatly on now in the research. Can we actually have parents being more confident of their abilities to actually support their children? But they need knowledge and support from the coach to do that. An empathy around role changes and transitions, because you know when you're working with children through childhood, adolescence, into young adulthood, that they will go through transitions in sport. The sporting demands will be elevated as they progress through different age groups, different demands placed upon them from particular transitions that occur. But therefore, parents go through transitions too with their child. The transition from shifting from one coach to the next can be quite a difficult transition for the child and also for the parent. So you've got to recognise what are the key transition points that children are going through, but what's the implication for the parent as well in terms of their support to their child and also managing themselves. And the reason why I put those 4 areas up in terms of the parent becoming more confident in a way which will help their child is because you really want parents to have enjoyment. You want them to be in a situation where they might feel worried about their child becoming injured, but at least there's mechanisms in place or support structures in place and appraisals in place where they can at least enjoy the experience more. Because, they're a key stakeholder in terms of the participation of young people. They need to be around and be involved, and therefore you want parents to enjoy the experience as much as possible. So think a little bit more about how you can facilitate that enjoyment, that role enjoyment in parents. When we talk about from the science around parenting, we talk about 3 key roles fundamentally. I'm going to go through these 3 with a few examples, but Camilla's touched upon this in terms of the provision of support, the provider of opportunities here. And of course, you see the multitasking mother, father here, I drive, therefore I am, in terms of the multiple responsibilities from a tangible support perspective, finance, taxi driver, laundrette, etc. Of course, it's not just the tangible support. There's the emotional support that we've talked about, the esteem support, the encouragement, and trying to generate self-belief and support your child with a positive attitude. And also informational support as well, in terms of advice. And sometimes that's where your role as a coach comes in, because you want to help them to understand more clearly what is expected of them. And if we think about trying to optimize the support provision to a young person so they feel optimally influenced and supported by the parents, can you help parents to understand some of the logistics of what they're getting themselves into and the emotional support that's going to be required given the demands of the sport that they're participating in? And that's a really important one, because when I work with parents, particularly in tennis, I'm often trying to help them understand the ways in which they might support their child psychologically better. What can they say to them? How can they respond to them to help them be more motivated, greater confidence, greater focus of attention, etc. And sometimes they say, well, we're interested in that, but actually we'd just like to know just the structure of the sport, how to enter tournaments, what the scheduling's like, all that kind of basic stuff. Some of the parents may not know the pathway, they may not know the organisational system and setup logistically. And I actually feel sometimes disappointed thinking, what, you don't want to hear about the psychology bit? And he said, well, yeah, but actually we really need to navigate the website and understand the situation. So don't take for granted that they know how the sport pathways are and what the journeys are, the entry routes. I hate the word exit routes, I hate that. But the entry routes into other parts of the program, like that. I think this is something we've touched upon in terms of sharing your philosophy as a coach with a parent and your ways of working, your expectations of them. Because if you're wanting them to have role clarity and they have role clarity, try to ensure that they're able to differentiate their role from your role and complement it. And take the time to do that. Take the genuine time and effort to do that as much as possible. And the final thing, in terms of the provision aspect, is it's about paying really careful attention to where the child's at in their journey through sport. Because some of Camilla's work actually in tennis talks about the alignment between the parents' goals and the child's goals for sport. Is there a shared understanding about where the child's going here? So the father talking about his son committing 16 hours of training a week in the pool, he understands his child is committed and he's going on a particular journey, and there's an appropriate support provision to facilitate that. But as a coach who spends, again, quite a bit of time with that child, you'll be able to have a read of where that child's motivation is at. What's the level of engagement? And can you see sometimes a child sometimes being less engaged or disengaged because maybe their goals aren't as high or as elevated as maybe the parents want them to be? And that kind of attention to that barometer of it in terms of the evolving needs and goals of the child, I think is important, because you want to ensure that the program is appropriate to them and their stage, and the parental support and provision is appropriate. With opportunities, for example, for the child to develop opportunities for more life skills, for more social skills. And I will say that because I'm quite a holistic psychologist. It's kind of develop the person through sport. Where's that balance, and does that exist in the program? And I also have experiences of working with athletes, and particularly one, recently, going from stuff about maybe 15 years ago, who owned up to being entrapped by the sport, wanting to probably stop playing or play to a different level, but felt out of guilt that they had to continue. And they were playing at a good level. But the guilt of continuing, because what it would mean to their mum and dad who'd invested so much money in this. And that kind of thing really struck a chord, because there was no sharing of that, no recognition of that. But you've got to look at the reasons for the children playing sport, and is it introjected? Are they doing it out of guilt? Because it's very difficult for a child to have a conversation with a parent, when that parent's potential, they see that parent who invested such a lot of money and time into it. But it's a really important one, because you don't want a sad kid who ditches the sport and leaves the sport forever because of it. So that's a really important role, I think. We talk about trying to help parents understand the psychological demands, the physical demands of the sport. I always spend quite a bit of time on this with parents that I work with, because I think when you actually help parents to have a discussion about why a sport is psychologically challenging or tough, be it from a mental, environmental, physical perspective, you actually help them to appreciate the types of roles that they play in supporting that child's motivation, trying to encourage, trying not to put pressure on in terms of an outcome focus. And I know Nick and others will talk about that later on. But spending time to have a conversation about why is this sport psychologically demanding? And of course, I used to spend a lot of time with other colleagues saying, well, why tennis is more psychologically demanding than football, for example, and draw the long list out there. Not least the fact that we have to win to get paid. But you can actually think about sport in a way in terms of individual nature, fear of injury, have to close out the match. There's no time out. Time won't run out in tennis, and you have to win the tournament. There's no draws. The number of decisions you have to make on a regular basis, which has a cognitive load. Your sports will have different psychological demands, which will promote different responses in the child, and the strategies and the qualities and skills you develop through the coach and with the parents determine how that child copes. So helping parents understand your role in that model bottom up to help meet the demands of the game helps them to appreciate the types of responsibility they have in creating appropriate expectations and not putting excessive pressure on young children. And that's definitely a worthwhile conversation having. The second role, which leads into that, therefore, is the interpreter role that parents play. Kids will learn kind of what's good and bad through what their parents say about the experiences that their child has gone through. So they'll be an interpreter for their child's experiences, a lens, as it were. And we talk about the critical lens that children, where children process and understand their sporting experiences, their performances, their outcomes through what parents say, maybe sometimes before a game, but also after a game that's happened. And children develop, ultimately, beliefs, their values, expectations, and attributions in sport via these interpretations that parents give them, the evaluations that parents make of them, and the reactions that parents offer, that they see in terms of non-verbal messages, not just verbal messages to children. So we'll take a good example of this, and we'll take a poorer example of this. So here's a poorer example of an interpreter role, or an interpretation that's probably not doing anything for helping the players or the athletes' accountability or responsibility. So here we go. I was just unlucky today, my dad said. He's told me that if I wasn't serving into the sun, or if the wind hadn't gusted up during that game, plus the bad line call that I got a 30-all, I would have won that match. Okay, so that's a typical example of a child picking up an interpreter, interpreting what the parent said, and that father's interpreting every external attribution under the sun for that kid's loss. Okay, so when we look at a better example of an interpreter role, of a conversation, I kept calm and politely asked if she would play a let in tennis. As my mum told me that some players see the lines differently. My mum was right, that going through this process helped me to stay focused with all of my effort and attention just on the next point. So you see a conversation or a value-setting interpretation role of a mother helping a player to take more responsibility, to be assertive, to actually focus on the values of effort and concentration next point. You know, so you can understand that parents play, and of course coaches play. You're all obviously also one of the key interpreters for young athletes in terms of the way you interpret wins and losses, the way you interpret performances that occur. But parents do too, because parents are in the car. Parents are in the car home, on the way back from home. They obviously also play a role pre-competition as well. And so I think part of the learning journey for parents you can help them out with is this type of interactions and conversations that they have with their child, and the values that and beliefs, expectations that they set for them when they're going into competition. So let's see a poor example of this. Probably what Will Ferrell would have said in this clip to his child. We've got this one. You shouldn't have a problem this round. He's ranked way below you, and he lost easily to the player you beat last week. That's a great draw to set up this tournament for you. The national coaches are here to take a look at you, so what a great opportunity we have today. Okay, so interpreter role, pre-match, and this kid is, I mean, there's a paper, I think, by Sam Sager and David Lavelli and Chris Spray in a journal, which has a quote by a parent very similar to that, actually. And it's about how children develop fear of failure. So it's children's perceptions of fear of failure, and look at the quote from parents around how that developed. You have a classic example of how that could develop like that. So when you're working with parents in terms of trying to optimize their role in a context where they're going to be involved potentially through text messages, because it's not just the obviously the conversations you would have in the car or around the tournament site or whatever the context might be. It's over the phone. It's the text messages, the little things where you can just send it, and of course you can't see the reaction from the child, but they're probably going to internalize and they recognize, okay, how is achievement being evaluated by my parent today? So that kind of work with the parents, I think, is important. And of course, as sports psychologists, we can work with parents like that. But of course, you know, you're a fundamental role with them. You're a lot more with them than we would ever be. I think the role that you want to encourage is around values-based communication. So how can you help parents to encourage enjoyment of the challenge of competition, consistency of effort and persistence in competition, maybe obviously around character and integrity as a goal and a value that's sustained and important to try and demonstrate respect for the opponent, respect for officials, teammates, etc. And again, reinforce children who do show that respect as well, because these are all the processes around competition, sometimes the behaviors that we can actually help children to show and demonstrate through competition, which in many respects will lead to better performances and optimize the possibility of better results. But you start with the fundamentals, the fundamental values and behaviors first. Positive support to teammates as a goal. Goals you've been working on. So actually encouraging them to talk about the goals that they have been working on with the coach. Not necessarily saying, remember to do this, to do that, to do the other, because that'd be quite controlling language. But actually, what you've been working on with the coach, talk to me about that, and actually prime them to think about some of the processes they've been working on with the coach and have that in the front of their mind when they're going into competition. And of course, trying to reinforce staying resourceful and composed. So all those aspects are processes, values, things which shape the beliefs about what is possible to achieve in competition beyond everything else that makes up a competitive encounter. And then Camilla's touched upon this as well in terms of the coping skills in competition, as well as a role and responsibility that's fairly central to parents to help them manage. One of the ways is through role-playing and actually, obviously, taking parents to explore the emotions they experience when they're set a scenario like that. The other thing is actually trying to practice their body language as well, how they hold themselves. You know, actually saying, okay, we're going to watch the match today, but how are you going to react? How are you going to hold yourself? I mean, so we might have not a very good example here, I would say. This is John Tomich, who's not looking very happy, with probably his son, but actually trying to share examples around posture, around the non-verbal reactions, non-verbal gestures that parents show, working with them on that. And at the same time, working with them on the post-match, the timing of feedback. And what I would say here is I always encourage parents to allow the outcome to sink in, the emotion to sink out, and the focus on it's the child's choice about when they want to discuss the match. So you provide independence and ownership to the child. I think it's important to go through the routine. So there's a responsibility for always to squeeze the learning from the encounter. So there's an emphasis on we are going to learn something from the match today. But actually, it's the child's choice when they do that, and trying to facilitate that reflection from the child first, rather than the parent first. So those are things I think that, as a coach, obviously, you can start to cultivate and craft with parents as you get to know them, and their children. The final thing, the final role, of course, is role model. You know, that you're a role model to your child, and the work I do in the UK nowadays is really focused around a model I developed with a professional soccer club a number of years ago called the 5 Cs. And for me, that is around trying to obviously work with coaches, work with athletes around some of the fundamental behaviours which underpin each of those particular qualities. So we can then, once we've identified those 5 areas or qualities, we can look at some of the behaviours and strategies which help to nurture those particular aspects. And Nick and colleagues will expand upon some of the psychological aspects throughout the day. But one of the features of that is actually asking the parents, sensitising the parents to that, but also asking them to think about how they are a 5C role model. How do they role model those particular qualities? So how do they role model being a motivated parent, or how do they role model good communication skills to their child? How do they role model self-control? So, you know, if you're watching from the balcony or the sidelines, how do you role model emotional composure? You know, how do you expect your child to model emotional composure when they're in the heat of battle, when, you know, the parent struggles to model it when they're not actually playing the game at all? So it's the type of challenge around that. So the role that you play in terms of trying to encourage them to model behaviours that internally reinforce attributes for use in sport and also for life in general. And ask them to reflect on that as parents. But it does come back down ultimately to this role modelling, the careful use of language and primes around, you know, patience, progress, respect, enjoyment, and having that being in the natural course of the language interactions, you know, that you have. And of course, participation in sport and exercise as well. So participation and engagement in sport, and taking an active interest in that sport for life philosophy. You know, watching with your son or daughter on TV an event taking place and then seeing how well he coped with that situation there. You know, look how well he recovered from being breakpoint down. He didn't give in at love 40, etc. Look at that hard work he put in. So there's ways in which you can model some of those or reinforce some of those psychological qualities that are going to be important for that child when they go and compete, even by trying to encourage them to reinforce the same messages when they're watching things on TV or their role models on TV. So those are some of the key things I think for you to hopefully take away from this in terms of provider, interpreter, role model, you know, to help parents to support their journey. I've got my warning. I am on time for once. So thanks for listening to me ramble on for the last half an hour, and I think it's time for questions. All right.
So thank you for that. Thank you for that. Chris, we are now in a period where we have about 15 minutes or so for questions. If you have any questions for myself or Chris, I think Chris is going to come here.
Right.
We'll do that. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, we do have a mic that may be roaming. It may or may not be working. But yes, does anyone have any questions? So I won't go into it too much because we do have a talk later on from Chris Henriksen who will talk about it a lot more in detail. But I think really what I don't even think I commented on it today, is really just about understanding for parents, understanding what talent is, understanding how talent develops and the environments that are required. But I do know Chris is going to talk all about that. So you've queued that up really nicely for him later on. Any other questions? Otherwise, Chris and I can just talk, so you might want to throw some more questions in there.
You did a good job.
You got 10 more minutes, Chris. You wanna go?
Nice.
No? Are we good? Any of the other speakers? Go on, Rodri.
Just in terms of when you've worked with parents or clubs, what have been some of the most successful methods that you've used to, I guess, educate parents in that role? So is it that you've hosted sort of parents' evenings? Is it more small group environments? What's been most successful in an applied sense?
Should I go first?
I think that in football, I mean, football and tennis, where most of my work's taken place with parents at a group level, certainly the focus on parents' evenings, trying to drag them away from watching their daughter and son play is sometimes a bit challenging. But actually, when you tee it up and set a series of evenings up, short, sharp bursts, so they're not going to be there for like 2 hours, but like half hour, 45 minutes, things like that. Certainly I find that within professional soccer has worked. And the way that I started is actually with Camilla, actually looking at, okay, what are the challenges that you face as a parent, and get them talking about the stresses, the challenges, the demands, etc., gets them on side, because parents can talk a lot about some of their roles. But once you've done that one workshop and built familiarity and rapport with them, you can then move on to saying, well, let's look at how we can help you cope or work with some of those things. And that kind of sort of expression then leads to a whole engagement in, right, we're going to do this, this, and this, and you get more engagement that way, with parents. But half-hour, hour sessions for sure is one starting point.
Chris obviously does a much better job than I do, because we really struggle. I'll be very honest, we do lots of work with parents, and we really struggle to get parents to attend. We struggle because they don't like looking at PowerPoints. They don't like being in a classroom. They had bad experiences at school. They don't want to be told how to parent, understandably. They have other kids who they've got to take time with. Actually, when their children are in training, that's the 20 minutes that they have for coffee, and they just want to be left alone. So there's a whole bunch of challenges. So I think if we sat here and said it's really easy to engage with parents and just do some talks to them, that would be maybe misrepresenting it. But what I found in my experience is if you can start to have the conversation that is very much taking that pressure off parents. There's no judgment here. It is an opportunity to talk to each other and get to know each other, and you can get them in the room and start that conversation, then it works really, really well. But sometimes it's getting parents into the room first, or getting that time. So we've actually started to shift our focus a little bit more to little booklets, email communication, e-blast kind of messages, setting up sort of group chats between parents. So we've sort of run into some barriers there, and I know sometimes for coaches it can be a big challenge to find that extra time to spend time with parents. And I think there's some examples of really good examples of coaches who work with parents by, when they set up a drill, a safe drill, or maybe if there's two coaches, once a week or once a fortnight, one coach does a lap. They do a lap of the parents. Okay, tonight I'm going to spend my session walking around and checking in with the parents and making sure things are okay. And then over time, once those relationships have developed, then it's easier to host your evenings or your nice weather like this, which I hear is very common in Norway. Go outside and have a barbecue and have a social event, and really try and just integrate it within the program, I think.
Well, they're both very different. I think that with the parent who doesn't come from necessarily a sport background, they're sometimes they're very eager to learn. They are the types of individuals I talked about before who struggle to understand the pathway first. So it's not the more intricacies of kind of how to support your child psychologically, which would be kind of where the parent coach who's got more of a kind of a sporty knowledge will take and knows the system. would be more interested. The parent who has no sporting background, you really need to ensure that the governing body helps them to actually navigate what the pathways are. But I've found certainly that working with with lesser knowledgeable parents, that they've been very open. They've certainly I guess made efforts to check in with me with the knowledge that they've gained from the workshops, and offer feedback. And parent coaches have too. I think the parent coach one is when it gets to a certain level of the sport, there's probably ultimately going to be a transition point where you might pass over or you might transition your child to another coach. And I think that is quite a specific example where some father coaches, for example, mother coach, but particularly father coaches have struggled a little bit in terms of how do they manage that process, and trying to ensure that essentially you switch back onto being a father every day of the week rather than playing parent coach role all the time. And there's definitely had examples where some fathers have been very over-involved and neglected potentially the daughter or son role, and that's a really tricky thing to work with them on. Apart from trying to remind them or trying to help them understand that your son or daughter has an identity, which isn't just sport specific. There could be other aspects of their self-concept you want to develop, to become independent in life, to have these other life skills as well. And you have to engage the role as a father or a mother to help them out, develop and cultivate those particular aspects of their self, as opposed to simply narrowing in their whole life based around one identity, which you keep alive all the time because you're talking tennis or talking football or talking this every minute of the day. And I think that's the piece of work that's most central for that.
Yes.
Well, I guess I've become, in my older age now, because I've recognised that I've got a limited time on the planet, I'm kind of I'm more direct with them, actually. I don't beat around the bush. I think that if I've got to know a parent and a child parent coach, and they're open to wanting to work on the psychological and social development of their child going forward, my communication style is, I'm going to be holistic and supportive here, but here's where I think you can help facilitate further, and here's some of the challenges that you might well have, and try to put a plan into place and show what the consequences might be, so you almost like paint the picture in 5 years' time. And you can do with all parents, you can do a back to the future exercise. They arrive at 10 years of age. Imagine your son or daughter at 17 in 7 years' time. They'll have achieved X, Y, or Z outcome. Full-time tennis pro, football pro, gone to university, etc., etc. What outcome is most satisfying to you? And that question gets people in the room discussing about what their real achievement goals are for their child, and gets mothers and fathers talking away. Well, I want this in my son. No, I want this in my daughter. Because that's when you really get to grips with what are goals or motivation of parents have for their child by 7 years' time. And the discussion point ultimately goes to, well, regardless of the outcomes, what qualities do you want your son or daughter to have in 7 years' time? What personal qualities through sport? You've got 7 years, and then it takes a turn to more of the psychosocial qualities that both want, obviously, their child to have. And then the light bulb moment comes and say, well, okay, well, we're going to work together on helping you to cultivate that. But it's going to take a journey. And I think if you start that way around, you begin to get to the parent bit of the parent rather than the coach bit of the parent.
And I would just add to that in terms of with the parent-coach role. I think, one of the most important things is, and I know we've had conversations just recently that a lot of the coaches in Norway are parents. And I think one of the things there is being really comfortable, if you are a parent coach, that actually you do continually check in with your child, right? That you are continually checking in with them in terms of what do they want, what are they hoping for, and putting some rules in place. So, between this period and this period, I'm coach. As soon as that period ends, I become parent. So I've worked with some parent coaches, and it's when we get in the car, then I'm parent now, right? That we're leaving and I've left it here, and kind of almost, not developing a contract, but almost developing, okay, these are the things that we're going to do that will work for us. And I think the other thing is really having a conversation, every so often checking in with yourself, whether you're as in parent role or in coach role, and just going, do I, on this day, what is it, the 23rd of May, do I know right now what my son or my daughter wants from sport? Do I know what I want them to get out of sport as a parent and as a coach? And actually sometimes just going, actually, I don't know. We haven't had that conversation for a little while, can be that reminder of, okay, we need to have a conversation to see how this is going to work. We probably have time for one more question if anyone has one. No? Go on, Chris.
Yeah, the parents that you portray in your talks are very sort of involved and engaged with their kids, and they're very emotional when the kids are doing well or not. And do you also get the parents that are sort of disengaged and don't care too much about their kids' role in sport? And what are the particular challenges and maybe even benefits of that?
So in my experience, they all care somewhat, whether it's caring about how they did on the pitch or on the court, or if they care about actually what did they learn or did they have fun, right? They care about something about the experience. And obviously if they can care about things like personal growth and fun and enjoyment, that's great. And if they can care less about kind of the winning and the losing. I think where the challenge really comes is when you have parents who maybe aren't so interested in how their child develops in sport, that they just do sport for fun, but you have a child who really wants to go far in sport or thinks this is something that's really important, that can be as challenging as when you've got a parent who really wants a child to go far and a kid who doesn't. And so that's where, when Chris mentioned about that importance of, do you know what the goals are and the reasons for being involved, having those conversations early on can be really, really important. So I don't personally have a huge amount of experience with parents who don't want anything from the sport, but when the goals are off, when there's a different alignment, I would say, is the issue.
Yeah, I must admit I don't have a great deal of experience of those types of parent. But probably because I've come mainly in sports where there's been a heavy investment and engagement to get to that point. If it's kind of upper level, football academies, they've been through a journey. They've had to be engaged. Tennis equally, you're not going to send a 9-year-old on a train to a tournament on their own. So, and you can't rely on lift shares all the time. So, it's. I'm sure those parents exist. You're right, but I've not really had a great deal of experience or.
I think within the purposes of this whole project, Sport Parent EU, I think we would really want parents to have some degree of involvement, because if we want kids to have enjoyable and safe experiences and we want to know that there's someone checking in, that's where parents become important. But there is a cultural aspect to this as well, right? So don't worry, you're not only going to hear from people from Britain. You'll hear from people from other countries where there's sort of different cultural expectations. So maybe it's a cultural thing. So we will call to an end this section. For people, this sounds strange, for people who are watching it on live stream, we'll stop the live stream and we'll start again after the coffee break. So we've got about just under 20 minutes for a coffee break now, which the coffee will be just outside. And then when we come back, it's a big shift in focus. So we have Rodri Lloyd and Thomas Love, who will be talking about physical training and nutrition. So it'll be a shift in focus. But thank you very much for this morning.